Thanks for tuning in today to learn about the propositions on this year's November ballot. There are a lot of propositions and they can be confusing, so we hope that you'll be learning a little bit about each proposition today and whether or not you want to vote for it. Now, the League of Women Voters is political. We do legislative advocacy, but we never support candidates or political parties. We're going to be talking about the propositions today, 17 on the state and 2 propositions on the county. So let's start out with one of the more depressing ones, and that is about the death penalty. Proposition 62 will repeal the death penalty in California. The proposition repeals the death penalty but replaces it with life in prison without the possibility of parole, and it does apply retroactively to death sentences that have already been handed down. It increases the portion of the inmate's wages that may be applied to victim restitution. So here's what would happen if it passes. The death penalty would be eliminated. The maximum penalty for first-degree murder would be life in prison without the possibility of parole. And prisoners currently on death row would have their death sentences changed to life in prison. All prisoners convicted of murder, including those serving life in prison, would be required to work. These are private sector jobs that are performed in the prison, but it would not be paid for by the state. The amount of money that could be deducted from inmates' pay would be 60% rather than 50% as it is now, and this could be used for restitution payments to victims' families. Now, the budget effect would be cost savings to the state, even though these persons are going to be serving life in prison, because the state incurs tremendous legal costs in defending death penalty cases. The state would actually save about $150 million annually in the first few years, including $55 million that would have been spent fighting death penalty appeals. So here are the arguments for this proposition. Getting rid of the death penalty would save the state millions of dollars each year, and this is the only way to make sure that no innocent person ever gets executed. Now, if you are turning to the reasons that you might want to vote no, is that you might feel that we need the strongest possible punishment for murder, and this is the only way that this could happen. The pay that inmates would pay toward the victims' families can't really make up for the loss of life. So supporters include the League of Women Voters, several newspapers, several political parties, and unions. And the opponents to repealing the death penalty include police organizations and the Republican Party. So let's talk about the League's motto, to follow the money, if you want to know where people are coming from on the different propositions. In support of this proposition to repeal the death penalty, about $8.8 million has been raised from wealthy individuals and from organizations. And those who oppose this proposition have raised about $4.2 million, largely from police and sheriff's organizations. So based on that, we hope that you will be able to make a better decision on whether to repeal the death penalty. Proposition 66 is just the opposite of Proposition 62. This would retain the death penalty in California, but it would change the procedures and change the timetable for death penalty appeals. This would start at the Superior Court for initial petitions, and it limits the successive petitions. It requires appointed attorneys to take non-capital appeals to accept death penalty appeals. This is a big issue because, as it stands, there are only a few attorneys that will take death penalty appeals. And if someone wants to appeal a death penalty decision, they can wait up to 15 years just to get an attorney. It exempts prison officials from the existing regulation process in developing execution methods. Now, if it passes, this would change the appeals process from death sentences to shorten the time that it takes. One type of legal challenges would first be handled by local courts before it could be handled by the state Supreme Court. A 5-year limit would be placed on legal challenges to death sentences, and additional lawyers would be made available to represent death row inmates. Inmates sentenced to death could be housed at any state prison. Now, the budget effect of this proposition is not really clear. State costs could be increased in the short term, possibly in tens of millions of dollars due to the court costs from the new shorter time limits. But the measure could save money for state prisons. Now, if you're in favor of this proposition, you would think that the appeals process could shorten the time for death row inmates, and it needs to be quicker and less complicated. Proposition 66 would save money and ensure that justice is carried out in a timely manner. If you're against the death penalty, you would say that Proposition 66 would cost the state tens of millions of dollars in legal and lawyer fees, and shortening the appeals process does increase the risk of executing an innocent person. Now, the supporters of this measure to keep the death penalty include police and firefighter organizations and the Republican Party. Opponents to this measure include several newspapers, several political parties, and unions. Now, if we follow the money to see who's in favor and who's against, the supporters have raised $4.8 million, largely coming from police organizations and district attorneys. Those who oppose keeping the death penalty have raised $10 million, and this is mostly from wealthy individuals and groups. Now let's talk about two competing propositions on this ballot, Proposition 65 and Proposition 67. Proposition 65 would redirect the money collected by grocery stores and certain other retails through the required sale of carry-out bags. It would require the stores to deposit their bag sale proceeds into a special fund to be used for certain environmental projects. So if it passes, Proposition 65 would change the way that money from carry-out bag sales is used. Instead of keeping the money made from each 10-cent bag, stores would be required to put the money into a state account. And we might note that in some instances it's been pointed out that the cost of actually producing these bags is about 15 cents per bag. The money would be used for different environmental projects, including recycling and cleaning drinking water. Money would also go for improving beaches and parks. Now, the budget effects could produce tens of millions of dollars each year for environmental programs, but it's not clear what would happen until after the election. The effect of the state budget will depend on whether Proposition 67 passes. If both of them pass and 65 gets the most votes, then the money would go into the state account. Now, people who are in favor of this proposition say that grocery stores shouldn't be keeping the money made from selling bags, and Proposition 65 would make sure that the money from the sale of bags goes into an environmental protection fund. People who are against this proposition believe that voters should support Proposition 67 instead. The most important thing is getting rid of plastic bags that clog all sorts of things in the environment and are harmful to wildlife. And Proposition 65 really wouldn't make very much money for the state because people would start bringing their own bags. Now, supporters include the California Republican Party, who believes that this proposition should pass and money should go into an environmental fund. Opponents include the League of Women Voters, several political parties, newspapers, church groups, and the Nurses Association. Let's follow the money for this proposition. The supporters of this proposition are plastic bag manufacturers, and they've raised $2.8 million to promote this proposition. We don't have information available on funds that have been raised by opponents. Proposition 67 is called the plastic bag ban. A vote for yes would approve a statute that was already passed by the state legislature that prohibits grocery stores from providing customers with single-use plastic bags or paper carry-out bags, but permits the sale of recycled plastic bags and reusable bags. Because Proposition 65 qualified for the ballot, the law that the state legislature passed in 2014 has never gone into effect. Proposition 67 is a referendum that asks voters to decide if the state's ban on single-use plastic bags should go into effect. Now, you might notice that, of course, quite a few cities and counties have passed these kinds of bans on single-use plastic bags, but this would apply statewide. Now, if it passes, voting yes on Proposition 67 would allow the 2014 state law to go into effect. All across California, single-use plastic bags would not be allowed at grocery stores, convenience stores, large pharmacies, and liquor stores. These stores would be required to charge for paper or thicker plastic bags, and they would get to keep the money. Voting no on Proposition 67 would prevent the law from going into effect across the state. The budget effect for the state would be relatively small. State costs for overseeing this law would be less than $1 million a year, and these costs would be paid for by fees placed on companies that use plastic bags. Now, the people who support this proposition say that single-use plastic bags are bad for the environment and harmful to wildlife. Proposition 67 protects animals and saves the state millions of dollars in cleanup costs. Of course, many communities have already banned single-use plastic bags, and it's time to extend the ban across the state. The people who are against Proposition 67 would require stores to charge 10 cents for bags that can be reused instead of offering them for free. Proposition 67 would allow grocery stores to keep millions of dollars from selling these bags, and of course that would cover the cost of producing them. Now, let's follow the money. The supporters of the plastic bag ban have collected $1.6 million in funds from grocery chains and environmental groups. The opponents of Proposition 67 have raised $2.8 million, and all of this money has come from plastic bag manufacturers.
Proposition 51 is a school facility bond measure. It would authorize $9 billion in general obligation bonds for new construction and modernization of K-12 public school facilities, charter schools, and vocational educational facilities. And California community college districts would have access to these bonds. So if it passes, it will allow the state to sell $9 billion in new bonds for educational facilities. $7 billion of those dollars would be marked for K through 12 public school facilities and $2 billion for community college facilities. School districts could apply for funds to buy land, repair old buildings, or construct new facilities and add technology to their existing buildings. The money from Prop 51 could not be used to hire teachers or pay for educational programs or other operational needs. The budget effect. The total cost to pay off the bonds plus interest would be $17.6 billion or over 35 years. Annually, we would be required to pay $500 million against the debt. People who support this measure say that many of our schools need repairs and upgrades to make them safe for our children. Prop 51 will improve education overall and help expand space at community colleges so more students can attend. People against say Prop 51 would add to the state's debt, which is already more than $400 billion. Bond measures should be passed locally, giving communities control of how money is spent. Supporters of this measure include police, the League of Women Voters, Republicans, Democrats, labor. Opponents include the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, smaller political parties, and newspapers. So if you want to follow the money, the total money raised is $11 million from developers. And opponents, there's no data currently available that any money has gone in to fight this measure.
Now let's talk about Proposition 53. This is a public vote on revenue bonds. Revenue bonds require statewide voter approval before any revenue bonds can be issued or sold by the state for certain projects if the bond amount exceeds $2 billion. This is only for very large state projects. So if it passes, voters would have to approve revenue bonds that add up to $2 billion for a specific state project. And bonds sold at the local level for cities, counties, or school districts would not be affected by this. The budget effect is hard to predict. There probably won't be very many state projects that using revenue bonds that cost $2 billion or more. Very large construction projects could be affected, such as high-speed rail or regional water systems. The cost will depend on whether voters approve specific bonds, and if they don't, whether the state decides to pay for the project in a different way. Now, people in favor of Proposition 53 believe that this proposition would enable the voters to directly choose whether or not the state can implement extremely large, expensive projects such as the Bullet train and the proposed tunnels under the Delta. It would close the loophole in state law that requires voter approval for general revenue bonds, but not billion-dollar revenue bonds. And it would protect California's long-term fiscal health by discouraging spending that adds to the state's debt load. And it would mandate transparency about the true cost of projects. Now, those who are against Proposition 53 believe that it will take away local control by requiring a statewide vote on many local projects, even when they are funded by local users and ratepayers. It would prevent delay and repair of the state's major water system, the most pressing infrastructure project that the state currently faces. It would prevent delay or repair to as a result of emergencies or natural disasters, because major projects, say for example if an entire freeway overpass system collapsed as a result of a disaster, they would delay that until the next time that voters could vote on whether to pay for that by bonds. And it would jeopardize California's long-term economic health and safety due to deferring necessary infrastructure work. Now, supporters of this measure include the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, the Libertarian Party, and the California Republican Party. Opponents of this measure include police, business groups, churches, Democrats, newspapers, and unions. The total money raised for this bond measure is $4.5 million from a wealthy couple who owns farms in California. And the opponents, we don't know how much they have raised. But it is striking that all of the money to promote this bond measure comes from one couple.
Proposition 52 is known as the Private Hospital Fee for Medi-Cal. It's an initiative constitutional amendment and statute. It extends indefinitely an existing statute that imposes fees on hospitals to fund Medi-Cal health care services, care for uninsured patients, and children's health coverage. In recent years, the state has imposed a special charge on most private hospitals. This charge is called the Hospital Quality Assurance Fee. It has been collected since 2009 and helps cover the cost of Medi-Cal. This money is matched by the federal government, which gives the state additional funds. What happens if this measure passes? It will make this private hospital fee permanent. The budget effect of this is that the measure will provide uncertain funding depending on what state lawmakers do before the current fee expires in 2018. If they decide to extend the current fee on private hospitals, there would be little to no change on the state budget. If they do not extend the fee on their own, then Proposition 52 would provide funds from hospitals to save the state budget about $1 billion each year. This savings is because the state could use less of its general fund money to pay for Medi-Cal. People for this proposition say that this guarantees funding for Medi-Cal, which helps low-income children and families. Prop 52 makes sure that state lawmakers cannot use this money for any other purpose. Opponents say that Prop 52 gives $3 billion a year in federal health care benefits to hospitals with no oversight or accountability and no guarantee it will be spent on health care. They say that it rigs the system in favor of corporations and hurts low-income people. Who are the supporters of this proposition? They include unions, newspapers, Democrats, Republicans, business, and churches. Opponents include libertarians, Friends, and the Friends Committee on Legislation. So let's follow the money. Supporters' total money raised is $13 million from hospitals and Democrats, and opponents' total money raised is $12 million from the United Healthcare Workers West.
Proposition 61 is about prescription drug costs, and you've probably already seen a lot of advertising on television both for and against Proposition 61. This proposition would prohibit the state from buying any prescription drug from a drug manufacturer at the price that would be higher than the lowest price paid by the Department of Veterans Affairs. It exempts managed care programs funded through Medi-Cal. Now, if it passes, it would limit the amount that the state would pay for prescription drugs. State agencies would not be allowed to pay more than the Veterans Administration pays for a particular medication. Proposition 61 would apply to most state agencies, except for the state's managed care system. However, that includes 75% of the people on Medi-Cal. The state would also regularly check to make sure that drug costs are not higher than those paid by the Veterans Administration. Now, the budget effect of this proposition is a little variable. How much the state would save depends on many factors. It's not always clear how much the Veterans Administration pays for medication. Sometimes they work out special pricing for a drug with a drug company that's not made public. The state may not be able to find out this information. And drug companies might also raise the prices on the Veterans Administration and refuse to offer the state the lowest price. Now, the people in favor of this proposition say that skyrocketing prescription prices are a matter of life and death. Proposition 61 would end the price gouging. Proposition 61 empowers the state to negotiate the same or better deals for taxpayers as are paid by the Veterans Administration. Opponents of Proposition 61 say that it only covers an arbitrary group of patients in certain government programs, and more than 88% of all Californians are excluded. Proposition 61 would eliminate drug discounts that the state currently receives, and it could increase the state prescription drug costs instead of reducing them. Now, supporters in favor of Proposition 61 include churches, the smaller political parties, one newspaper, and a nurses' association. Opponents of Proposition 61 include police, the Friends Political Committee, California taxpayers, and newspapers. Now let's follow the money for Proposition 61. Supporters have raised $14.4 million, but virtually all of this money has come from the AIDS healthcare organization because AIDS is a condition that requires a lot of prescription drugs. Opponents of this proposition, get ready for this, have raised $86.9 million, and this all came from drug companies.
Proposition 55 is called the Extend Tax on High Income. It extends by 12 years the temporary personal income tax increases enacted in 2012 on earnings over $250,000 with revenues allocated to K through 12 schools, California community colleges, and in certain years, healthcare. The 2012 income tax increase would be extended until the end of 2030. People earning more than $250,000 and couples earning more than $500,000 per year would pay between 1% and 3% higher taxes on income over these amounts. The money collected from these taxes would provide more money for schools and community colleges. Prop 55 would also provide extra money to the Medi-Cal health care program in some years. The temporary increase in sales tax would expire. Prop 55 would raise between $4 billion and $9 billion in taxes each year for the state. Roughly half of this money will go towards schools and community colleges. Medi-Cal could receive up to $2 billion extra annually, depending on the taxes collected and other factors. People for this proposition say that Prop 55 maintains existing tax rates, so the wealthy pay their fair share to provide adequate funding for education and health care. Prop 55 has strict accountability requirements, making sure that the funding reaches the schools. People against say that voters who approved Proposition 30 were promised that the increases would be temporary, not permanent. Proposition 55 tax increases are not needed to adequately fund education, health care, and state government, and would be a job killer. Supporters of this proposition include the League of Women Voters, Democrats, newspapers, and unions. Opponents include taxpayer associations, Republicans, newspapers, and businesses. So let's follow the money. Supporters' total money raised are $56.7 million from hospitals, unions, and wealthy individuals. Opponents' total money raised is $3,000 from 3 individuals.
Proposition 56, the tobacco tax initiative, is really easy to understand. It increases the cigarette tax, $2 a pack, with the same kind of increases for other tobacco products and electronic cigarettes that include nicotine. Now, if it passes, Proposition 56 would provide a tax of $2 per pack of cigarettes, and the tax would also apply to cigars and chewing tobacco and to electronic cigarettes that include nicotine. The money from the tax would help to pay for several health care and education programs. Now, the budget effect is like this. The state would collect between $1.3 and $1.6 billion in the first year of the tax. In future years, the money could be lower if people buy fewer tobacco products. Most of the money would be used to pay for tobacco education, extra training for doctors, and the state's health care program for low-income Californians. Now, supporters of the tobacco tax say that cigarette smoking kills more than 40,000 Californians annually. 40,000 deaths coming from tobacco products each year just in California. The tobacco tax increases one of the most effective ways to reduce smoking and other tobacco use. Taxpayers now pay about $3.58 billion every year for tobacco-related health care costs. Under Proposition 56, the tax tobacco users would help to offset that cost. And Proposition 56 doesn't take a dime from schools. It protects school funding while helping to keep our kids from getting hooked on deadly and addictive tobacco products. Opponents of Proposition 56 say that it's not what it appears to be. The insurance companies will be paid $1 billion more for treating the same Medi-Cal patients that they do today. And Proposition 56 allocates just 13% of new tobacco tax money to treat smokers or stop kids from starting. And 56 will undermine our Constitution's school funding guarantee. In California, the state is responsible for schools. And it will divert at least $600 million a year to health insurance companies and other special interests. Now, supporters of Proposition 56 include police, environmental groups, newspapers, and labor groups. Opponents of Proposition 56 include taxpayers' associations, Republican Party, Libertarians, and the Peace and Freedom Party. Now, if we follow the money, we find that supporters of Proposition 56 to increase the tobacco tax have raised $28 million, and this money has come from hospitals, unions, and some wealthy individuals. The opponents of Proposition 56 have raised $66.3 million, and this money has all come from tobacco companies.
Proposition 57 is called Parole, Sentencing, and Court Procedures. This proposition is both an initiative constitutional amendment and a statute. It allows parole consideration for nonviolent felons, authorizes sentence credits for rehabilitation, good behavior, and education, and provides the juvenile court judges decide whether a juvenile will be prosecuted as an adult. What if it passes? It will make changes to the state constitution about sentencing and court procedures for two kinds of situations. Adults convicted of non-violent felonies would be eligible for parole hearing after serving time for their main crime. Inmates may also have more opportunities to reduce their sentences through credits for good behavior and approved educational activities. Changes would also be made to youth court procedures. Youth accused of a crime who are 14 to 17 years old could not be tried in adult court unless it was decided by a juvenile court judge. The budget effect of this would be by reducing the adult prison population, the state could save money in the tens of millions of dollars each year. Moving youth offenders to juvenile courts would save an additional few $1 million. Counties would need to spend additional money in the short term to supervise a larger number of felons on parole. Moving youth out of adult court would likely cost counties a few $1 million each year. Supporters say that Prop 57 focuses resources on keeping dangerous criminals behind bars while rehabilitating inmates and saving tens of millions of dollars. Without a common sense long-term solution, we will continue to waste billions of dollars and risk a court-ordered release of dangerous prisoners. Opponents say weakening of California's anti-crime laws have gone too far. California's Constitution should not be amended to give more rights to criminals. Prop 57 is a poorly drafted measure classifying crimes such as rape by intoxication and assault with a deadly weapon as nonviolent and eligible for early parole. Supporters include churches, the Democratic Party, newspapers, unions, and teachers. Opponents include police, the Republican Party, newspapers.
Proposition 60 deals with the use of condoms in adult films. Now, this is something that has come back on our ballot again. We had a proposition before about this, so here we are again, and this deals with requiring adult film performers to use condoms during filming a sexual intercourse, and it requires producers to pay for the performers' vaccinations, testings, and medical exams. It requires producers to post condom requirements at their areas where they're doing films. So here's what would happen if it passes. Adult film producers would be required to make sure condoms are used while filming intercourse, and adult film producers would be required to get a license and provide information to the state about their film shoots. These requirements would apply to pornography produced by film studios as well as productions by individual performers or couples. The state's workplace safety agency would have more time to investigate and fine adult film producers that do not use condoms, and California residents would be allowed to directly sue as individuals adult film producers for not using condoms if the state failed to take action. Now, the budget effect for the state is difficult to say exactly what would happen if this law passes. If companies and individuals decide to move out of California, and state and local governments would likely use several $million in taxes each year. The cost to enforce the law would be about $1 million each year, and this cost would mostly be paid by film fees on adult film producers. Supporters of Proposition 61 say that it closes loopholes in existing state law and improves enforcement, so the adult film industry is held to the same workplace protection law that applies to every other California industry. In other words, it protects the workers. Proposition 60 is supported by numerous medical and public health organizations. Opponents of Proposition 60 say that it's opposed by numerous civil rights and public health organizations and business leaders, and they say that Proposition 60 creates a dangerous new public right of action, authorizing any resident of California to file a lawsuit directly against adult film producers and distributors. Now, the supporters of this measure, Proposition 60, include churches, the Peace and Freedom Party, newspapers, and nurses groups. The opponents of Proposition 60 include the Friends Committee on Legislation, Libertarians, Republicans, Democrats, and newspapers. If we follow the money, the Proposition 60 supporters have raised $4.5 million, and most of this has come from the AIDS Healthcare Organization. Opponents of Proposition 60 have raised $423,000, and this is mostly money from film producers.
Proposition 63 is known as the gun and ammunition sales. It requires a background check and Department of Justice authorization to purchase ammunition, prohibits possession of large capacity ammunition magazines, establishes procedures for enforcing laws prohibiting firearm possession by specified persons, requires Department of Justice participation in federal, national, instant criminal background check system. And what if it passes? Proposition 63 would create a new court process to make sure people convicted of felonies and some other crimes do not have guns. Probation officers would be required to make sure these people have given up their guns. People could turn their guns into the police, store them with a gun dealer, or sell them to a gun dealer. Prop 63 would also make it illegal to possess certain types of gun magazines or clips that hold a large number of bullets. The budget effect is that new court procedures could cost in tens of millions of dollars annually. Costs for prisons, jails, parole, and probation would probably not be more than a few $1 million each year. Some of the costs would be paid for by fees on ammunition sellers or gun deal buyers. Supporters say that Proposition 63 will save lives by preventing dangerous criminals, domestic abusers, and the dangerously mentally ill from obtaining and using deadly weapons. Prop 63 will protect the right of law-abiding Californians to own guns for self-defense, hunting, and recreation. Opponents say Proposition 63 is opposed by the law enforcement community and civil rights groups because it will burden law-abiding citizens without keeping violent criminals from accessing firearms and ammunition. Proposition 63 will burden the court system with the enforcement of flawed laws. Supporters include the League of Women Voters, Democrats, newspapers, and unions. Opponents include police associations, Republicans, small parties, and newspapers. So let's follow the money. Supporters' total money raised is $5 million from the Democratic Party and other individuals. Opponents' total money raised is $700,000 from gun rights groups and other individuals.
Proposition 54 is another proposition that we've seen before, but this makes changes in the legislative process. This proposition prohibits the legislature from passing any bill unless it's published on the internet for 72 hours before a vote, and it requires the legislature to record its proceedings and post them on the internet, and authorizes the use of recordings. Now, if it passes, the legislature would be required to put bills in print and post them online at least 72 hours before voting on them. All public meetings of the legislature would be recorded and posted online within 24 hours, and any person would be allowed to record public meetings of the legislature. Proposition 54 would put these changes in the state constitution. Now, you might wonder, why is this necessary? The people who have presented Proposition 54 are concerned with radical changes in bills that have already been heard in state committees and passed forward to the total legislature. There have been situations where what's called a gut and amend process has been used, where just before they're ready to take a vote on the state Senate or the state Assembly floor, that they completely change the content of the bill. They take out all the provisions of the previous bill and put in a whole different set of presentations. So this gut and amend means completely eliminating the content of the original bill, and at the last minute having the state legislature vote on it, when nobody has had a chance to see what this legislation involves. Now, supporters of Proposition 54 say that it will give the public and their elected officials time to read and express their opinions on legislation before it's enacted into law. And it puts an end to the process of gut and amend. It ensures that all open meetings of the legislature are recorded and posted online so the public can view them, and among other things, you know what your legislature is actually supporting. Now, opponents of Proposition 54 say that it will introduce unnecessary, burdensome, and time-consuming restrictions on the way laws are written. It makes a small technical change. It makes small technical but needed changes in bills introduced at the end of the legislative session more difficult to accommodate. And it gives lobbyists and special interests extra time to lobby and launch campaigns to attack hard-fought bipartisan compromises. Supporters of Proposition 54 include churches, business associations, taxpayer associations, the Republican Party, and newspapers. Opponents include the Democratic Party and unions. Now, the actual amount of money raised to promote this legislation is $10.5 million, almost all of it contributed by a wealthy individual who wants to see a more open legislative process. And we don't have data on contributions from opponents.
Proposition 58 is about English language education. This proposition preserves the requirement that public schools ensure students obtain English language proficiency. It requires school districts to solicit parent community input in developing language acquisition programs. Requires instruction to ensure English acquisition as rapidly and effectively as possible. Authorizes school districts to establish dual language immersion programs for both native and non-native English speakers. If it passes, schools would no longer be required to teach English learners in English-only programs. Schools would be allowed to use bilingual programs to teach English based on the needs of their students. School districts would have to get feedback from parents about how English learners should be taught. The budget effect of Prop 58 would have little effect on state budget. Costs for school districts and county governments would be small. Schools might need to develop new programs or train teachers, but these costs would likely be paid for within their current budgets. Supporters say that Prop 58 allows districts to meet local needs with greater flexibility. Proposed programs must be evaluated objectively based on outcome and research. Opponents say being surrounded by English speakers leads to faster English language acquisition. Schools shouldn't return to methods that haven't worked. Supporters include the Sierra Club, churches, the Democratic Party, unions, and teachers. Opponents include libertarians, the Republican Party, newspapers. So let's follow the money. Supporters' total money raised, $3.8 million from wealthy individuals, unions, and teachers. And there's no data available on any money against this measure.
Proposition 64 has received a lot of publicity, and this is about making marijuana use legal for anyone in the state. It legalizes marijuana under state law for adults 21 and over and imposes state taxes on sales and cultivation. It provides for industry licensing and establishes standards for marijuana products, and it allows local regulation and taxation too. Now, if it passes, this will make it legal to grow, possess, or use marijuana for adults 21 and over. Businesses growing and selling non-medical marijuana products would also be regulated. There would be limits that the amount that a person could possess for individual use, and taxes are set for retail sales and on growers of non-medical marijuana. Money for these taxes would pay for things like youth programs, environmental protection, and drug education efforts. Now, the budget effects are a little unclear about actually the cost of Proposition 64 and how much money it would raise. The amount coming in from taxes depends on how much non-medical marijuana is grown and purchased through the new legal system. Over time, the state and local governments could earn taxes in the hundreds of millions of dollars, or more than $1 billion each year. The state and local governments could also save tens of millions on court and law enforcement charges each year. Supporters say that Proposition 64 would bring in revenues over $1 billion and could save tens of millions of dollars annually and reduce law enforcement costs. Proposition 64 would end the criminalization of marijuana by creating a safe, legal, and comprehensive system for adult use of marijuana while protecting our children. Proposition 64 would adopt the best practices from states that have already legalized adult marijuana use. Now, opponents of Proposition 64 say that it would increase highway fatalities because it has no protection for driving under the influence of marijuana because there is no test available. Proposition 64 would prohibit local governments from banning indoor residential growing of marijuana, even next to an elementary school, if the crop is limited to 6 plants. And Proposition 64 would allow felons who have meth and heroin convictions to be licensed to sell marijuana. Now, the supporters of Proposition 64 include the Peace and Freedom Party, the Green Party, the Democratic Party, churches, newspapers, and the Nurses Association. Opponents of Proposition 64 include the Republican Party, police associations, newspapers, and libertarians. Now, if we follow the money on Proposition 64, we find that supporters have raised $22.2 million, including very large donations from some wealthy individuals and also the fund from public policy reform. Opponents for Proposition 64 have raised $2.4 million, also from wealthy individuals and from police associations.
Proposition 59, known as Political Spending Advisory Question, it asks whether California's elected officials should use their authority to propose and ratify an amendment to the federal Constitution overturning the United States Supreme Court decision in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. Citizens United ruled that laws placing certain limits on political spending by corporations and unions are unconstitutional. So what if it passes? A yes vote on Prop 59 asks California state lawmakers to do everything in their power to reverse the Supreme Court Citizens United decision. Because Prop 59 is an advisory question, it only provides lawmakers with public feedback. Voting yes or no does not guarantee that the U.S. Congress or state lawmakers will move to amend the U.S. Constitution. So the budget effect. Lawmakers may or may not take any specific action. This measure would have no effect on the state budget. Supporters say corporations and billionaires should not be allowed to continue to buy elections, and yet the Supreme Court gave corporations the right to spend unlimited amounts of money in our elections. Overturning Citizens United will open the way to meaningful campaign finance reform that will return ownership of elections back to ordinary Americans. Opponents say Prop 59 is a waste of your tax dollars because it will not change the law. Our ballots should not be clogged with pointless, non-binding measures. Instead of working to amend the Constitution, we should work to require the disclosure of political contributions within 24 hours of receipt year-round. Supporters include police associations, the Democratic Party, newspapers, and unions. Opponents include the League of Women Voters, the Republican Party, and newspapers. Let's follow the money. Supporters' total money raised is $206,000 from Next Gen Climate, the Democratic Party, and other individuals. And there's no data available on any money spent to oppose this proposition.
Proposition A is a county measure rather than a state proposition, and it's just on the ballot for Los Angeles County. This will provide funding for parks, beaches, rivers, open space, and water conservation. The county funding to support city and county parks and recreation facilities is expiring. A proposition to replace these funds with a uniform parcel tax fell short of the 2/3 majority the last time we voted on it. And so to lay a foundation for replacing the park funds, the county conducted a comprehensive parks and recreation needs assessment last year, and with 50-some hearings all over the county. Sessions held over the county established the scope, scale, and location of park needs and established a basis for allocating funds. Proposition A would provide a 1 cent per square foot of improved property tax, different from the flat parcel tax on all properties in the 2014 proposition. This would come to, say, for example, $22.50 for a 1,500 square foot home. And of course, it would be higher for larger residential and commercial properties, which would pay much more. The measure would raise about $94 million in taxes every year. A citizen oversight panel would be required, and there would be independent audits of the funds used under this proposition. Supporters of Proposition A say that Proposition A maintains and improves vital public resources and improves the quality of life for residents. Proposition A would provide funds to cities as well as the county, guided by a comprehensive needs assessment, by citizen oversight, and independent audits. Now, opponents of Proposition A say that Proposition A will make housing more expensive and fails to address critical problems. It has no guarantee that your local area will receive park funds, but will tax low-income people and small businesses at the same square footage rate as larger businesses and larger residential properties.
Measure M, unlike the other propositions, is strictly a Los Angeles County ordinance and to be voted on by Los Angeles County residents only. This ordinance would be called the Traffic Improvement Plan, and it requires a 2/3 vote for passage. The Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority wants to improve freeway traffic flow and accelerate rail construction, enhance bus service, bike and pedestrian connections, and highway safety. The ordinance would impose a 1/2-cent sales tax within Los Angeles County only. The sales tax would increase to 1% on July 1st, 2039, when the Measure R 1/2-cent sales tax we currently pay would be expiring. Metro will be required to establish and administer a separate revenue fund and create an independent taxpayer oversight committee to oversee this fund and the work that's being done. All audit reports, findings, and recommendations would have to be made public. Metro may make certain amendments to this ordinance by a 2/3 vote of the Metro Board. Arguments in favor of Measure M say yes on Measure M will keep seniors, disabled, and student fares affordable. In 15 years, the number of Los Angeles County residents that are 65 years or older will expand to over 2 million residents. Yes on Measure M invests in van services and public transit so more seniors and students and the disabled can move around. The nonprofit Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation estimates that Measure M will create 465,000 new jobs throughout Los Angeles County. A yes on Measure M gives Los Angeles County a guaranteed source of funding that can be used to get hundreds of millions of dollars in state and federal matching funds. Otherwise, those matching funds would go to other jurisdictions. Supporters are labor, environmentalists, transportation experts, and leaders from every corner of Los Angeles County. Arguments against Measure M. Yes, we all want less traffic and smog, and better and clean and safe public transit, but Measure M doesn't accomplish these things. Vote no. The streets, roads, and freeways we use are all falling apart, but Measure M doesn't make fixing them a priority. Improvements to the I-5, the 605, the 710, and the 405 won't be completed for decades. Measure M taxes people who can't afford it, spreads social and racial injustice, and makes discrimination worse. The opponents are a coalition of transit advocates, social justice leaders, and more than half of the other cities in LA County. The budget estimate is that this fund could take in up to $860 million annually.
Thanks for taking the time to learn more about the propositions on your November 8th ballot, and we hope that you'll go to the polls and vote on these propositions. If you have further questions about the propositions, you can find much more information on the League of Women Voters Voters Edge website that's shown on the bottom of the screen. If you go there and click on different options, you'll find a great deal of information about these propositions and feel confident in your voting process.